It was the summer before my senior year, a period that felt less like a vacation and more like a sentence. I'd always been the quiet one, the kid with their nose perpetually buried in a book, weaving intricate fantasy worlds in my head, rather than engaging in the messy, unpredictable reality of teenage social circles. My idea of a perfect summer involved dim lighting, a comfortable armchair, and an endless supply of stories. So, when my parents announced we were spending a month at a remote beach house, an old, sprawling place inherited from a distant, rarely mentioned great-aunt, my initial reaction was a groan so profound it could have registered on a seismograph. I pictured sweltering heat, sand in regrettable places, and the crushing boredom of no Wi-Fi. What made this particular summer different, however, what coiled a strange, unsettling thread of anticipation around my initial dread, was the way my mother's voice had dropped to a near whisper when she spoke of the house. "It's old, Liam," she'd said, a peculiar tremor in her tone, "and a bit isolated. Aunt Maeve always said it had a certain energy." That word, energy, hung in the air, charged with a meaning I couldn't quite grasp, but which promised something far more intriguing and infinitely more terrifying than mere boredom. It was the first time I'd ever felt a genuine prickle of curiosity, a whisper of dread about a forced family vacation, and it made me want to know exactly what kind of story this summer was going to tell. The journey to the beach house was long, punctuated by stretches of highway that dissolved into narrow, winding coastal roads bordered by gnarled, salt-blasted trees. Cell service, as predicted, died a slow, agonizing death about 20 miles out. Even the radio began to crackle and fade, until all that was left was the hum of the tires and the occasional huff from my dad in the driver's seat. When we finally rounded the last bend, the house emerged from the twilight like a forgotten sentinel. It wasn't a charming, quaint beach cottage. This was a house, 3 stories tall, painted a muted, faded gray that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its windows, dark eyes staring out at the turbulent evening sea, were numerous and unevenly spaced. A wide, wraparound porch, its wood bleached white by years of sun and spray, sagged slightly in places. The nearest neighbor, if you could call them that, was a good mile down the coast, their lights barely visible as distant specks. Beyond the property's small, overgrown yard, the beach stretched wide and desolate, meeting the crashing waves of the Atlantic under a bruised, purple sky. The air inside was heavy and still, smelling of salt, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old iron, mixed with the musty scent of forgotten things. Every footstep echoed on the wooden floors, and the silence was so profound it almost hummed. My parents, despite their initial excitement, seemed subdued, their voices softer, as if afraid to disturb the quiet. My younger sister, Chloe, usually a whirlwind of restless energy, clung to my mom's hand, her eyes wide as she peered into the shadows that clung to the corners of the rooms. "Well," my dad said, breaking the silence with forced cheer, "home sweet home for the next month." It didn't feel like home. It felt like stepping into a photograph, faded and forgotten, from another century. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, exploring, and adjusting to the oppressive quiet. My room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the ocean. It was sparsely furnished with heavy, dark wood pieces, and a large, ornate mirror hung on one wall, its silvered surface cloudy with age. At night, the sound of the waves became a constant, rhythmic roar, a living presence that filled the void left by familiar city sounds. I found myself sleeping poorly, waking often to the sound of the house settling, or was it settling? The creaks and groans of old would sounding like footsteps, whispers carried on the wind. Chloe, usually fearless, started complaining of bad dreams. She'd wake up crying, claiming a shadow man stood at the foot of her bed. My parents dismissed it as the unfamiliar surroundings, new house jitters. But even they started to look a little tired, their eyes holding a certain wariness. My mom found an antique locket on the mantelpiece that hadn't been there the day before. My dad swore he'd left his reading glasses on the kitchen counter, only to find them later on the porch railing, damp with dew. Small things easily dismissed, but they began to accumulate. I too started experiencing oddities. Books I'd left on my nightstand would be lying open on the floor in the morning. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, like dried wildflowers and mildew, would sometimes drift through my room, though the windows were closed and the only flowers outside were hardy beach grasses. One night, I was convinced I heard someone humming a lullaby downstairs, faint and melodic, but when I crept out of my room, the house was utterly silent, save for the ocean's roar. I started spending more time alone, drawn to the disquieting atmosphere of the house. I found an old, locked wooden chest in the attic, but could never find a key. I explored the small, sun-drenched library, filled with books whose pages were brittle and yellowed, many of them obscure nautical histories or forgotten poetry. But the room that truly captivated and repelled me was on the third floor. It was at the very end of a narrow hallway, tucked away, almost hidden. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft emanated from within, even on the warmest days. Inside, it was bare, completely empty except for a circular discoloration on the floorboards where something large and heavy must have stood for a very long time. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of climbing roses, peeled in long strips from the ceiling. A single, tall window faced the sea, but it was grimy and seemed to constantly weep condensation, blurring the already indistinct view. Whenever I stepped into that room, the air grew heavy, the silence pressed in, and a profound sense of sorrow, almost despair, washed over me. It felt like a place where something terrible had happened, or was waiting to happen again. I started calling it the cold room in my head. One particularly stormy afternoon, trapped indoors, the rain lashing against the windows and the wind howling like a banshee, the strange occurrences intensified. Candles flickered even when there was no breeze. A stack of old newspapers in the living room suddenly scattered across the floor, as if tossed by an unseen hand. Chloe, playing with her dolls, shrieked, pointing to the hallway. "They moved, Liam. They moved by themselves," she cried, referring to a pair of old, porcelain figurines that now lay shattered on the floor, far from where they'd been perched on a shelf. My mom, looking pale, wrapped Chloe in a hug, murmuring about the old house and the storm, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. That night, lying in bed, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within me, I felt a distinct chill spread across my skin, despite the warmth of my blankets. The rhythmic crash of the waves seemed to be punctuated by another sound, softer, closer, a scraping, scrape, drag, scrape, drag. It sounded like something heavy being moved across the floor, directly above me. The cold room. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew my parents and Chloe were asleep further down the hall, their snores faintly audible through the storm. I was alone with whatever was making that sound. Curiosity, that morbid, intoxicating impulse, overruled my terror. I slipped out of bed, bare feet cold against the wooden floorboards, and crept to my door, easing it open. The hallway was a tunnel of oppressive darkness, punctuated only by the distant flashes of lightning through the windows. The scraping continued, relentless, methodical. I ascended the main staircase slowly, each step a potential betrayer, creaking under my weight. The air grew colder, the scent of mildew and decaying flowers more potent. On the top landing, the scraping sound was unmistakable, coming from the cold room. I could almost feel the weight of what was being dragged. As I approached the cold room's open door, the sound abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of something waiting. My breath hitched in my throat. I stood rooted to the spot, my eyes straining to pierce the gloom. Then, a whisper, faint as a moth's wing, brushed past my ear. It wasn't a word, just a drawn-out sigh, laden with an unimaginable sorrow. And then, a sound that made my blood run cold, soft, wet sobbing, coming from inside the room. It was raw, desolate, full of a pain that felt ancient. My hand, as if guided by an outside force, reached out and pushed the door open just a few more inches. Moonlight, weak and distorted by the grim window, filtered into the room. And there, in the center of the bare floor, where the discoloration marked the spot, was a large, dark stain. It hadn't been there before. It was fresh, still glistening. And floating in the center of it, shimmering in the weak light, was a single, long strand of dark hair. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed the window shut with a deafening crash, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Simultaneously, a cold, clammy hand clamped down on my ankle. A choked scream tore from my throat. I stumbled backward, pulling my leg away with frantic force. The grip released, but as I scrambled away, my hand brushed against something wet and stringy. Hair. So much hair. Everywhere. I fell back against the wall, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The sobs in the room intensified, guttural and broken, then transformed into a low, mournful moan that spiraled into a high-pitched wail. A dark, indistinct shape began to coalesce in the center of the room, growing taller, more defined, absorbing the faint outline of the window. I could feel its presence, a profound sorrow mixed with an icy rage. It wasn't a shadow man, not anymore. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her head seemed to loll unnaturally, and her form, even in the near-total darkness, seemed to shimmer, as if made of water or moonlight. I could hear a soft clicking sound, like bones grinding together, and the metallic tang, stronger now, filled my nose, the smell of old blood. The wail cut off, replaced by a guttural gasp. Then, a voice, raspy and choked, filled the room, not with words, but with a torrent of raw, unadulterated pain. It was a scream that ripped through the very fabric of the house, of the night of my sanity. It was a scream of betrayal, of loss, of an agony that had never dissipated, trapped within these walls. Pure, unadulterated terror seized me. I didn't think, I simply reacted. I scrambled back, stumbling over my feet, racing down the stairs, not caring about the noise I made. I burst into my parents' room, shaking them awake with desperate cries. There's something in the house. Upstairs. The third floor. It's real. It's real. My dad, groggy and disoriented, tried to calm me, but the sheer panic in my voice, the glazed, wide-eyed look of terror, must have conveyed the truth even before my words registered. My mom, seeing my face, didn't try to rationalize. Her own face paled. "What happened, Liam? What did you see?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't explain it, not coherently. All I could point to was the lingering scent of iron and mildew, and the sound of that scream still echoing in my ears. But they saw the terror in my eyes, the cold sweat beating on my forehead, the way my hands shook uncontrollably. My dad, despite his skepticism, slowly got out of bed, grabbing the heavy flashlight he kept by the nightstand. "I'll just check it out, son. Probably the storm." "No!" I choked, grabbing his arm. "Don't go up there. She's there. She's angry." But he slowly pulled away, a concerned but firm look on his face. He disappeared up the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the darkness. Chloe and Mom huddled together, listening. Seconds stretched into minutes. The only sound was the incessant drumming of rain against the windows. Then we heard it. Not a scream, not an explanation. Just a dull, sickening thud from the third floor, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging, scrape, drag, scrape, drag, and then a faint, metallic clatter. My mother's choked gasp was the only sound in the room. We waited, frozen. Then, slowly, my dad reappeared at the top of the stairs. He descended stiffly, his face ashen, his eyes wide and vacant. He didn't look at us. He stared straight ahead, as if seeing something beyond our reality. In his hand, clutched tightly, was a small, tarnished silver locket, the same one my mother had found on the mantelpiece days ago. It had a single strand of long, dark hair caught in its clasp. "We're leaving," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Now." We packed in a blur, driven by an unspoken, primal fear. Bags were thrown into the car haphazardly. Chloe was bundled up, still half asleep but sensing the urgency, not asking questions. My mom looked back at the house just once, her face a mask of horror, before slamming the car door shut. As we sped away, leaving the gray Sentinel behind, I risked a glance back. The light from an upstairs window, the window of the cold room, flickered on, glowing with an eerie, sickly yellow light. And for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, dark and indistinct, watching us go. A thin, pale hand pressed against the glass. We drove through the night, not stopping until the first faint streaks of dawn appeared on the horizon. My parents didn't speak of what had happened, not directly. They just kept glancing at me, their eyes filled with a new, terrifying understanding. My dad never explained what he saw or what he felt in that room. He never had to. The locket, he held on to it for a long time, before eventually burying it deep in the backyard once we were home. The summer was over, but something had irrevocably changed within me. The world no longer felt like a safe, predictable place. I saw shadows where there were none, heard whispers in the wind even in bright daylight. The quiet kid who once dreamed of fantasy worlds now lived in a waking nightmare, forever haunted by the memory of a desolate beach house, a cold room, and the chilling, sorrowful rage of a presence that had never truly left. I never went back to that beach house, and as far as I know, neither did my parents. It stands there still, I imagine, a gray ghost by the sea, waiting, always waiting. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear the faint, distant echo of a woman's scream, carried on the salt-laden air, telling a story that was never meant to be heard.